Our next porch story was recorded August 7th, 2019. It is called Canoe Culture on Penn, Cove, and it is presented by Rick Castellano. Well, welcome everybody. I'm Rick Castellano. I love canoes. I love talking about them. And I just love talking.
Yes,
there you go.
And we know that too, yeah.
And another reason I use notes is because I'm Italian, and if I don't have something in my hands, I'm going to be doing this all the time. So we're just going to start out. Hi, Judy.
Rick.
Join the crowd. I call this Canoe Culture on Penn Cove. I'm standing right next to an amazing map here that shows where there were 9 villages, native villages here on Penn Cove, all the way around. And we're sitting on the site of one of them, right here. The original Lower Skagit village was at Snake Point. And the Skagit tradition says that was their place where their creator put the first Skagit people. So that's their Garden of Eden just down the road here a bit. And it's a very special place. We have host Indian canoe races here every year, the Water Festival. This is the only non-reservation location for the Water Festival because this is such a special place. So we should all be very honored at that. The first settlers that came here were, it looks like they were from somewhere inland. They weren't familiar with seafood and the virtues of seafood. This because of the remnants found in ancient shell middens. As you get down to that lowest layer, you're finding mostly mammal bones. And it's interesting because as time progresses, fish bones start showing up. Shellfish became almost exclusively their entire diet. That's all you find in shell middens unless you go really, really deep. So that's something to kind of keep in the back of our minds. So when they first came here, when you think about the trees grew right down to the water line. Big fir trees, cedar, giant trees right down to the water line. It probably didn't take them long to figure out that it would be a lot easier to just pick your food up off the beach. Because you have the tide twice a day. The table's set, as the saying goes. And, clams aren't going to turn on you and charge after you, like a mammoth might.
Yeah, I don't know.
Of course, they might have been really mean clams in those days.
And big ones.
And really big ones, yeah. So it would only make sense that canoe development would have begun early on. And, it makes you wonder if those inlanders that moved here, that resettled here, brought some different type of canoe making skills with them, because there were a lot of variations of canoes here. Not so much in Penn Cove, but here in the Northwest, the greater Northwest. So today, however, we'll be talking about canoes noted by early explorers and settlers, particular to our region, noted in 19th and 20th century writings and photos. Probably the most iconic canoe form that many of us think of when we talk of Northwest Indians is the large family canoe. That's the one like the Snakelum canoe downstairs, which after we talk today, if you would like to go for a little tour, I would be happy to lead you on a little tour and show you all sorts of cool stuff. It has this form of the large family canoe. We associate the bow looking like a dog's head or some kind of animal form. This is still the form used by native pullers in the annual canoe journey, which just terminated up at Lummi. If any of you, I know you were there.
I wore the shirt to prove it.
Yeah, that's right. That glows in the dark, I bet. If you've never been to a canoe journey, you've got to go to a canoe journey. It's amazing. It's amazing. I know, yeah, Judy, you were there too. You called me from there, all excited.
It started in Olympia? Is that where
it started? It started at many different points. We had pullers there from New Guinea. So it took them a long time to get here.
Oh, yeah.
Even by airplane.
Yeah.
It was a long time to get here. Thank you. Okay. This is going to take a while. So native carvers will say this is not designed, the bow on a traditional canoe, to look like a dog, but in fact it's designed to efficiently cut through the waves, as these canoes were built to be ocean seaworthy. In fact, every inch of their canoes are designed with a purpose. Although some of canoes of higher ranking tribal members might have been adorned with abalone shells and decorative paint schemes to look cool. The wave cutting feature of the earliest canoes recorded by the earliest explorers was much more prominent in the canoes of the northern Indians. Once you get up into British Columbia and southeast Alaska. The earliest drawings of these canoes show 60 or more passengers in a canoe, so they were pretty big.
Wow.
And really big, intimidating prows. So that bow piece, in some cases, was 10 feet high or higher. So if you can imagine big old, highly adorned war canoe pulling up on your beach with 60 angry-looking Indians in it, with this big prow, and these mythical creatures painted, that'd be pretty intimidating. And I'm sure it was. All the canoes in the Pacific Northwest coast were carved from cedar logs, although I've seen references made to using yew wood, which I don't know why they would do that when cedar would be so plentiful. Usually a village might have one or two members who were skilled canoe carvers. In our area, most of the family canoes were traded for from the Makah Indians in Nia Bay, or across the straits on Vancouver Island, and the Nootka people. Surely there were exceptions, but most of the canoes made on Penn Cove by the Lower Skagit people were similar to the smaller fishing canoe, which we have an excellent example of one in our exhibit downstairs, which was carved by Alex Kettle for a young white girl. It was a simple, double-ended, flat-bottom canoe built for 1 to 2 people. Thank you, Judy, for rescuing that. The Upper Skagit and other Northwest Indians who lived on freshwater excuse me, built and used shovel nose canoes designed for slow-moving rivers. They had a flat bottom, very shallow draft, maybe about like so, and rectangular shape similar to a large carved food tray, which you'll see in the basement. Not a shovel-nose canoe, but a large carved food tray. An Indian food tray. Okay, don't. You're going to the cafeteria. I can hear that in your laughter. You'll see one when you're downstairs, if you go downstairs. One person, excuse me, one person would paddle the canoe while the other would stand in the bow. So these shovel-nose canoes were maybe, 12, 14 feet long with 2 people, and one of them was standing up, and they didn't tip over. The first 30 times they probably did. Of course, the person standing up would stand in the bow with a spear, ready to spear fish in the clear water as they were just floating along with the current. Obviously, that style would not work in the salt waters of this area. Because even when it's calm out, there's always a little bit of a chop in the water, and a canoe like that would not make it. According to early oral history, our Snakelum canoe was built for old Chief Snetlin, also Snakelum, Sneetlin, a bunch of different spellings and pronunciations, around 1850. It was built by an Indian called Sam Wick, by the early settlers. Mr. Wick was described as a member of the Skagit tribe. The question is how would a Skagit person know how to build a northern-style family canoe? We know that also know through oral traditions that old Chief Snetlin was described as a benevolent tribal leader, but he was also a fierce warrior when called upon or challenged. One story speaks of the old chief returning home at Snakelum Point while his lodge was under siege by northern Indians. which was a pretty regular practice. He noticed that his lodge was occupied with raiders in the midst of their pillaging, and supposedly Snetland landed his canoe, brandished a large knife, charged into his lodge, later emerging with more than a dozen enemy heads tied together, dragging behind him.
Wow.
He then organized his people and neighboring tribes to assemble a large flotilla to seek revenge on the northern raiders, which was fairly uncommon in this area, people going up that way. It was reported that he returned with several slaves who made fine canoes for him. In later pioneer journals, and after the old chief passed away in the mid-1850s, Sam the slave is mentioned as a laborer on some local farms. Could this be Sam Wick? Was he the slave who built Snetland's canoe? Was he the one who used blue Alaskan clay to decorate the interior of the hull? Was he the one who positioned the nose of the doghead pointing upward when virtually all others point downward? And we probably will never know the answer to that, but at least it's some interesting speculation. You know, was that doghead nose up in the air? Was that kind of a to the guy that owned him? The blue clay is very unusual down here in this neck of the woods, and it's the clay is when you dig it up on the beach up in Alaska, it looks like gray clay, but when it's exposed to sunlight, it turns blue, this sky blue color. If you ever want to see an amazing example of it, go to the University of Alaska website and look at Babe the Blue Ox, because it's a Ice Age musk ox remains that are sky blue, and it was found in a clay deposit up there, the blue clay. What makes the clay blue are these little microscopic creatures that create phosphorus in the water at night. If you've ever done that, run your hand through or a paddle, it's amazing. When they die, they turn into these little miracle creatures in blue clay. They get embedded in the blue clay. To make a canoe, the builder would search for the perfect tree, one with very few or no limbs, high enough to allow for the hull of the desired length, with as few knots as possible. 25 to 35 feet was fairly typical in our region, with 2 to 6 pullers, although canoes over 60 feet long were built and might carry an entire village and thousands of pounds of cargo. They were also known to lash canoes together and make a catamaran of sorts. They would run logs between them and put a deck between the two. Sometimes they would build fires on those decks to attract fish and go out fishing at night. And they did all sorts of things with these amazing craft. The canoes were made by carving from solid logs of red cedar in our region, but in some areas they might be made of Sitka spruce or cottonwood. I said yew earlier, I meant cottonwood. The basic form was carved, and careful use of fire helped remove the wood from the hull's interior. Carving was done using the elbow adze, which is a sharpened stone attached to the elbow of a tree. You just hack away at it. If you, before you leave today, make sure and look at our freshly painted racing canoes out here, because you can really see the carving marks in those now that they've been painted. It's very apparent, very interesting. Skillfully carved canoes have neat ridges left from the carving, which add to the beauty of the canoe and display the high level of the carver's work. Later, when steel started appearing from shipwrecks, metal blades were used and cherished. Canoes were kept moist with seaweed during their construction to prevent splitting. The canoes were then widened beyond the original diameter of the log by spreading of the steam-softened sides. Spreading does more than widen the canoe, it also introduces major changes of form throughout the hull, which the canoe maker must anticipate in carving the log. The straight and level gunnels bend smoothly out and down, while the ends rise, forming a graceful shear and transforming a rigidly narrow, hollow trough into an elegant watercraft. So if you were to take a pea pod, split the top, and kind of push it together from the ends. That's what that steam canoe would look like. I kind of glazed over the steaming part, but they would fill the canoe with water when they got the basic shape ready, put hot rocks in that water to get it boiling, and cover that, the whole thing with cattail mats to hold the steam in. While it was steaming, they'd build a fire around the outside of the canoe, just a low fire, but a hot one. And the fire from the outside would shrink the wood fibers on the outside, while the fibers on the inside were expanding. So you'd start out with a shape like that, and it would start slowly opening up like a flower petal. While it was opening, they would start putting spreaders in there, usually made of tree branches, and keep working it that way until they got to the desired form. And by doing that, just like the pea pod, the bow would start lifting, and as well as the stern would start lifting. So that must have taken a long time to figure that out. That's amazing. That is amazing. In order to spread without splitting, the walls of the hull are made remarkably thin, but not too thin. Thickness is checked by, in some cases, they would drill small holes in the hull and insert little pegs to determine uniformity of the hull thickness. Although a lot of carvers just did this, pinched it. When you're out looking at those canoes, don't tell anyone I said you could do this, but you can reach in there and feel, especially on the telegraph out there, it's got to be less than 3/4 of an inch, and that's a 50-foot long dugout cedar canoe. How did they do that? I'll tell you. Okay, we talked about the steaming. Fastened thwarts were then replaced the spreaders, the tree branches. They would put in carved thwarts that are more traditional. They would tie the wood pieces to the hull through small holes drilled for that purpose. All of our canoes they've never been tied, they've been pegged. That was an alternate way of doing it. Any cracks that might occur were stitched together with tough cedar withes. Okay, we've seen evidence of that in the Snakeland canoe downstairs, but they were replaced with metal later on, and that was part of its downfall before we started restoration on it, as the metal and the wood did not react well together.
What's a withe?
Cedar, like a thin cedar branch that you can use to like stitch
Oh,
with. If
the
you're
branch
good.
or the root?
The branch. I guess you could use roots too, but they speak of branches specifically. You know, the skinny.
Yeah.
But yeah,
Twiggy
roots
part.
would probably work even better. The distinctive bow and stern pieces were made separately and carefully fitted and pegged to the hull. This was done to prevent splitting if the canoe took a hit when it was landing or in rough waters. If you have one piece of wood and the grain runs the whole 9 yards and that bow gets the brunt, you have a chance of your canoe just splitting in half. So I can guess how they figured that out too. And this is really cool. When you're downstairs, look at that Snakeland canoe up at the bow, and you see this smooth, the dog head or the wave splitter coming down. If you look really carefully, you see this little tiny notch there that goes, that's for weight distribution. And it helped keep the bow piece in position. What that does, if you do take a hit, or if somebody foolishly picks up the canoe by the bow, which you never do, that little notch will save the day, because the weight from picking up or getting hit on that wave cutter is transferred directly to that notch. So the engineering that went into these is pretty amazing. It's not just, carving a stick. Traditionally, the canoes were painted red inside to represent a living creature, because that's what they are. And they were charred black on the outside. Part of that was to help seal the fibers, and part of that happened, I'm sure, when they were, building the fire to spread the canoe apart in the first place. Paddles were usually made of maple or yew and smoothed with dogfish skin, like sandpaper. If they were painted, they were usually painted red, sometimes red and black. They would be charred black, painted red. Paddles were made in three forms, generally, and all were relatively narrow in width compared to our Anglo-style canoe paddles that tend to be wider. One style was fashioned in an elongated diamond form. That's pretty much the typical Native American canoe paddle, with a sharp point at the end of the paddle. These paddles entered the water silently, for stealthy hunting of sea mammals. It's one of the reasons they're skinny and pointed. They could also be used as a temporary hitching post to stake canoes to the shore during a brief stay. They could also be used as a weapon when encountering the canoe of a hostile party. When landing in another's territory, it is proper etiquette to come close to shore with the paddles all pointed upward to show your peaceful intentions. You'll see that at the canoe journey. If they have 100 canoes, every one of them has to come in, bow first with their paddles up, ask permission to land, and then once they're granted, they go out and they do a big circle and come in stern first before they beach their canoes. Another style of paddle is scooped out in the middle of the paddle body to form a two-pronged fork shape. Supposedly this was used and designed to pin down a rope when being towed by another canoe. Because when they went out on a big canoe expedition all together, a lot of times they would take turns towing the others. Maybe the first two canoes would tow 6 behind them. There's a photo, I don't know if it's in our collection, I don't think it is, I think it's in the Hebel Cultural Center's collection, of a flotilla like that with like 9 canoes all hitched together.
Okay. I saw those.
Did you see that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it seemed to be associated with the canoes from Alaska, primarily.
That could be. Yeah.
But I never asked anybody why this peculiar shape.
So when canoes returned home, they were placed on posts with cross pieces to rest. They were never left to sit directly on the damp earth for any stretch of time. When Lewis and Clark visited what is now Astoria in 1806, they reported the Chinook Indians deftly maneuvering their canoes in severe weather, noting their design shipped waters out more effectively than their own craft. The hulls of those canoes they go out like this. So when they're plowing through that water, that prow splits the water, sends it back along the gunnels, and the water goes out. That's why when you see canoe bailers, they have special canoe bailers from that period made out of cedar bark wrapped with cherry bark around cedar frame. You know, that we're talking 35-foot canoes and the bailers are about that big to scoop the water out. And I asked one of the canoe family from Swinomish, I said, why did you guys use such little things for bailers? And he says, because we're not supposed to have water in a canoe. So, you know, if it might rain, we might get some in there, and, you know, that was enough. Okay. Let's see. Typically, Indian pullers would place cattail mats on the bottom of the hull and wrap them around the thwarts. They didn't sit on the thwarts. They would kneel on the mats and use the wrapped thwarts to lean against. They've kind of changed that practice where they have low-lying seats in the canoes now, which is a little more comfortable, I would speculate. The earliest explorers also noted that the mats were used to create square-rigged sails for the canoes. It's unknown if this innovation was developed by observing sailing vessels of lost mariners, perhaps from China or Japan that got caught in the current, or if this was their own creation. But they used those sails even after contact. The bow cap of the canoe is notched, right where this would be if I were a dog and my ears were up like this. There's a notch that runs right down here. That was to keep their spears at the ready. Sometimes they would lay their masts for their sails there. Everything had a purpose. Let's see here. The smaller canoes, of course, were used in places like Penn, Cove, where it was relatively protected, and the big canoes, family canoes, were used out in the straits and out in the ocean. They're ocean-going craft. So everybody had a family canoe. Okay, we have pictures of villages here on Penn Cove with canoes parked everywhere, big family canoes, but they weren't made here. They would trade with the Nootka Indians mostly for those canoes. The Macaw and across over on Vancouver Island is where most of the canoes from here came originally, with the exception of the Snakeland canoe that supposedly was built right here. When moving to a seasonal village for food gathering or fishing purposes, two canoes could be connected with planks. We talked about that, effectively making a deck on which house planks and other items could be loaded for transport. They'd bring their houses with them, or at least the planks. Indian families truly saw their canoes as one of the family. They treated them, and they still treat them, with great respect and tradition. Many of those traditions live on to this day. One of the strictest traditions is to never refer to a canoe as a boat. If one is in a canoe and makes a comment about, "What a great boat," you just might go for a swim. I've been warned. When beaching their canoes, non-tribal members are not allowed to assist. Don't touch them. When invited to assist, it should be considered a great honor. Touching canoes by non-tribal members is also considered very bad form unless, of course, you're invited to ride in one. So when you go to a canoe journey, you can go and take all the pictures you want, just don't touch them, because they'll let you know. As one of our local historians, Lee James, pointed out to me, local tribal members lived and died in their canoes. Traditionally, when a tribal member of high standing passed away, their body would be wrapped in blankets and placed in a new canoe, which would then be placed high in the branches of a tree. Sometimes a second, smaller canoe was used as a lid of sorts. The placement of the canoes in a tree prevented scavengers from feasting on the body and spreading the bones. Members of lower standing would be laid to rest in smaller canoes, and it's based on their status level. Slaves were sometimes buried in shell middens, so they weren't treated well. When disease started decimating large numbers of natives en masse, canoe burials became impractical, and the deceased were buried in the ground or sometimes burned in their lodges, or in extreme cases carried to a remote location or abandoned village and left to the elements. Cremation was never a common practice among Northwest natives unless to cleanse a lodge of disease. Vancouver's journals, he reports passing a village, which I believe was on Mailer's Point, according to his description, where there were just mounds and mounds and mounds and mounds of bones unburied. And that was the sign of the earliest smallpox epidemics. Pretty horrible. By some estimates, over 90% of the indigenous population was decimated. When settlers first arrived, Indians were regularly hired to transport the new arrivals from place to place. Dr. John Coe Kellogg, who was known as a canoe doctor, because natives used to take him out in their canoes on his calls, his doctor calls. In fact, he was on a canoe call when the Northern Indians came to kill Colonel Eby. And that canoe call saved his life. And unfortunately, Colonel Eby wasn't so lucky.
Didn't Wiley used to do that?
What's that?
Didn't Wiley used to do that?
I think so.
Still does.
the treaties were signed in 1855, and the tribes of this area were consolidated on the Swinomish Reservation. Collaboration and interaction between the settlers and tribal members deteriorated, or virtually ended. In the late 1800s, Indians began racing other tribes in their special narrow-hulled canoes. The largest, like the Telegraph, right out there, are over 50 feet long, cedar dugouts. These races helped raise awareness of the tribes and the non-tribal communities and were a source of cultural pride for the natives. This was also kind of a sneaky, ingenious way of getting around these laws, these assimilation laws that our government put in place, forbidding Indians to participate in their own cultural practices. So they figured, well, hey, we'll put on the water festival, we'll bring all our canoes to Cookville, and they'll love it. And they got to do stuff like have their Slahow gambling games, and they could sing their songs while they were out paddling. And so, bless them for doing that. Our own Penn Cove Water Festival was first called the Indian Canoe Races. It was first celebrated in 1929 by invitation of local merchant Wiley Hesselgrave and our local Chamber of Commerce. And in spite of a 50-year hiatus from 1942 to 1992, it still happens every year in May, depending when the tides are, usually the second or third week Saturday. Cookville is, I mentioned before, the only non-reservation location for the race. We're so honored because this is such a special place for the Lower Skagit people. In 1989, the first paddle to Seattle was held to put Northwest Indians back into their traditional canoes and to promote cultural pride and zero tolerance for drugs and alcohol. Still a major problem for the native population since being introduced to alcohol by the earliest American settlers. But they're gaining ground, they're doing well in that area. The canoe tradition continues and has had great success in restoring cultural traditions and community pride. Modern dugouts are mostly made of cedar laminate or other modern materials. The traditional dugouts are very rare due to a very limited supply of old-growth cedar trees. This museum is very fortunate and honored to be the stewards of 8 cedar dugout canoes. 7 of them are authentic, and there's one out there called the Lil Husad. I don't know if I said that right, but I gave it my best shot. Lil Husad. It's a reproduction of an 11-person racing canoe. The Snakelum family canoe was given to Cookville through Wiley Hesselgrave when Charlie Snakelum, grandson of the old Chief Snetland, died in 1934. Alex Kettle, an accomplished canoe carver and the last of the Lower Skagit people to live and die here, helped deliver the canoe to this site. The racing canoes, beginning with the Telegraph, which won every race, I think every race except the first one it was in, were also given to Cookville by the Swinomish and others in appreciation to Mr. Hesselgrave and the town for inviting them back for this special event. Of course, this was before we had a museum or even a historical society, which this is our 70th year, started in 1949. So when we were formed in 1949, the canoes were cared for, and after being in 2 other locations, our museum was opened in 1991. We just received, not just, this was last year, received a $3,000 grant from Swinomish to help us maintain these fine canoes, and which we just got done doing. They're beautiful. And we recently moved really unusual canoe into the basement. We have 3 canoes, 3 of the canoes are in the basement now. The Snakelum family canoe, the Alex Kettle canoe that he made for Mary Fullington. She was a little girl. So as 10 years old, she could paddle from here over to Santa Fuca and back. A lot more fun than riding a bike. And then the other one is a double-ended rowing dory. That's how I would describe it. But it's a dugout canoe that's been converted into something that looks more like a double-ended rowing dory. It's got wooden oar locks. It's even got trim around the outside, like bumper trim. And we really don't know anything about that canoe. It has seats in it. So it looks like a traditional white man's boat, but it's a dugout. So the question is this an example of assimilation? Is it an example of adaptation from one design, to carried over, or inspiration? Did a non-tribal member carve a dugout rowboat? We don't know, but it's very cool, and I've never seen another one like it. Any questions?
Where did
So
you
far?
get that last one?
What's that?
How did you acquire that last one?
I think this one it came from Lopez Island with no provenance. So I'm not even sure how long it's been in the collection. Records were not real complete until later.
Tell you.
I wasn't going to say that. But no, they're still not complete, but we do the best we can.
Native sources
We don't know.
made any comments? I mean, no.
When we've had native canoe people here, visitors, they're amazed by it too. They say, well, who made it? They're supposed to tell us that. So,
Just to fill you in on the canoe journey this year, which was held in Lummi, it was the 30th anniversary, and there were over 110 canoe families signed up for it. I don't think all of them made it, but a lot of them did, and they came from as far away as Alaska, Bella Bella, the outside of Vancouver Island, all the way to Oregon, and there were even reps from Hawaii, which I didn't think, and Australia.
New Guinea?
Well, New Guinea, they weren't canoers.
Oh, they were just there for fun.
Oh, yeah.
No, they were traditional people from New Guinea to learn more about solidarity among the indigenous community all across the world. And since the dawn of civilization, indigenous people have been under attack. And now with Western culture's exploitation and colonization, they are in increased jeopardy of losing their culture, their lives, their lifestyles. But it was like Rick said, it was pretty exciting. It was a splendid event, so respectful and so sweet, I would say. There,
And everyone's invited.
and everybody's
Everyone's
invited.
invited.
White people like my wife and I, and other people were warmly received. And what impressed me the most was how involved the kids were. They were totally absorbed. They have, after they land, everybody gets to do protocol in the longhouse, the Wexlium there. And it was packed to the gills. And the protocol is this process they go through where they share their songs and dances. They paddle in ceremonially, and it concludes when they ask for permission to leave. They have to ask for permission to land and also to leave. And the standard response when they ask permission to leave is, yes, of course. Thank you for coming and sharing with us your songs and stories. And we hope and pray that your homes are in good shape when you get back. Because that related to the time when these things,
No.
But
What wonderful experience.
it was exciting, especially the kids, there's often audience participation. And the kids are in there. They're doing it, they're riveted if they're spectators. I might mention that I think Swinomish Days is coming up this weekend.
Oh, really?
I think so. I think
Oh,
it's
that
the
is.
10th and the 11th.
Yes, they're
So-
gonna do bone games.
If you do go to, if you're interested, go to Deception Pass and, what's the beach there, across the,
Rosario?
Rosario Beach. And, no, the one before that.
Bowman Bay.
Bowman Bay,
Bowman Bay.
sorry about that. And you can have a salmon dinner, and they bring a couple of family canoes that you're invited to go out with and learn about the canoe culture. And
what do you
as
do
they
when
always say, it's a spiritual experience.
What do
Let
you
me
do when
say
you're
that.
in a family canoe? What you don't call it?
You don't call it a boat.
Good
And
job.
what is shared on the canoe stays on the canoe. So really, it's really
Beautiful
an amazing experience.
My wife and I were fortunate enough, we went to the canoe journey at Quinault a few years ago. And we were up at Point Grenville watching all the canoes come in. And we're up there with the cameras and binoculars, and this is one time I learned sometimes it's not always a good idea to bring a camera, because you're looking in this little thing taking pictures instead of looking at the whole scene, because I heard somebody yell, "Whales!" And there was a pod of orcas following these guys in.
Yeah.
They were paralleling the canoes. And you could hear the pullers down there on the water singing as they were coming in. It was beautiful. So, go and meet these people, good people. Anybody else? Okay. If you would like to go through the museum and see the canoes in the basement, I'm happy to take anybody down there. Just stick around for a minute, or if you all want to come, just follow me. I know where they are.
That's good.
On your way out,
And you have a key?
look at I got a key.
And
Never felt from both.
the best way to appreciate the skill and beauty of those things is to stand at the bow and just look at how finely contoured. As Rick said,
Amazing.
it's a lot of love, engineering, and precision went into making those things.
Thank you, Rick.
Yes.
Yeah.
You're welcome.